Why do avoidants struggle so much with commitment? I know, commitment is already serious for most people. But for avoidants, it's something entirely different. It's not just about choosing one person or defining a relationship. For them, commitment means giving up the independence they've relied on their entire lives. While most people see commitment as building something together, avoidants see it as losing control over their own space and time. In this video, you'll discover the exact shift that makes avoidants actually consider commitment, the step-by-step technique to apply it without games or manipulation, and the 3 critical mistakes that undo all progress. By the end, you'll understand why everything you've tried hasn't worked and what actually does. People spend months being patient, understanding, giving space when needed. They go along with the slow pace. They accept the inconsistent texting. They don't push when the avoidant cancels plans or goes quiet for days. And somehow, the avoidant only gets more distant. The more someone tolerates, the less the avoidant shows up. This happens because avoidants process relationships through a completely different lens. Where most people see consistent communication as connection, avoidants see it as obligation. Where most people interpret someone making time for them as care, avoidants interpret it as pressure building. Their brain doesn't register care, it registers expectations. And expectations trigger their need to create distance. When someone is always there, always understanding, always patient with the breadcrumbs, the avoidance brain doesn't think appreciation. It thinks safety and predictability. It thinks this person isn't going anywhere, so nothing needs to change. This creates the core problem. The avoidant never has to choose because someone is already choosing for both of them. The solution isn't in giving more space the way most people think about it. The actual issue starts much earlier, in what people accept, before they ever consider space. Most people accept less than they want without recognizing it. They tolerate weeks between seeing each other. They accept one-word replies. They make themselves available whenever the avoidant finally reaches out. They adjust their expectations downward over and over, telling themselves this is what understanding looks like. This acceptance creates a dynamic where the avoidant never faces a choice. Why would they commit when they already have someone who sticks around without commitment? They get companionship without obligation, connection without pressure, attention without reciprocation. From their perspective, the situation is ideal. Nothing motivates change when everything works in their favor. What shifts this dynamic comes down to 2 specific actions. Stop accepting less and start disappearing. Not as manipulation, not as games, not as a temporary strategy to get their attention, but as a genuine redirection of energy away from someone who isn't meeting effort halfway. This means removing the safety net of always being there, always being understanding, always being available. This principle extends beyond avoidance. Any person takes someone for granted when there's no risk of losing them. When someone is always available, always understanding, always waiting, there's no urgency to commit. People commit when they feel they might lose something valuable, not when they know someone will stick around regardless of their effort. The avoidant just makes this dynamic more obvious because their attachment style amplifies the pattern. Avoidants operate from a framework where independence feels safer than closeness. When their freedom feels secure, when no one is pushing for more, when someone accepts their minimal effort, they maintain exactly where they are. Communication stays minimal. Plans remain vague. Availability doesn't increase. They're comfortable. And comfort is the enemy of change. But when someone stops being available, something fundamental shifts in the dynamic. No more instant replies. No more adjusting schedules to match theirs. No more waiting around for them to decide when to reach out. The avoidant loses their comfortable position. And in that loss of comfort, they start experiencing something unfamiliar. Uncertainty about whether this person will still be there. This uncertainty is what avoidants rarely feel in their relationships. They're used to being pursued. They're used to people waiting. They're used to putting in minimal effort and having someone stick around anyway. That predictability allows them to stay distant without consequence. Remove that predictability, and their entire calculation changes. Avoidants don't respond to patience. They respond to absence. This goes back to how their attachment patterns formed. They grew up learning that showing needs or expecting closeness didn't lead anywhere productive. Maybe their caregivers were inconsistent. Maybe emotional expression was dismissed. Maybe independence was rewarded while vulnerability was ignored. So they built self-reliance as protection. They maintain distance not because they don't want connection, but because connection historically came with disappointment or felt overwhelming. Understanding this background matters because it explains why the typical approach fails. Most people try to counter the avoidance distance by being even more accommodating. By proving they won't demand anything. By accepting whatever pace the avoidant sets. By never complaining about unanswered texts or last-minute cancellations. The thinking goes, if I'm patient enough, understanding enough, low pressure enough, they'll eventually feel safe and open up. This logic is backwards. Each accommodation doesn't build safety. It reinforces that their minimal effort works perfectly fine. It teaches them that nothing needs to change. The avoidant isn't learning that this person is safe. They're learning that this person will accept anything. The acceptance shows up in predictable patterns that repeat across different relationships with avoidance. Things start well. There's initial interest, regular communication, consistent plans. Then gradually, the avoidant becomes less available. Texts take longer. Plans become less frequent. The energy shifts from active engagement to passive response. The natural reaction is to be understanding, to give them time, to not make waves, to tell yourself they're just busy, stressed, processing things at their own pace. You make excuses for behavior you wouldn't tolerate from anyone else, and every understanding response reinforces that their minimal effort has no consequences. Watch the typical progression. Week 1, daily communication. Week 3, every other day. Week 6, sporadic messages when the avoidant feels like it. And at each stage, the other person adjusts. The adjustment feels like patience, but it's actually acceptance of less. Each time the bar lowers, it becomes harder for the avoidant to see any reason to raise their effort. This connects directly to the demanding that pushes avoidance away, not the obvious demanding, not asking where things are going or what the relationship is. The subtle demanding that shows up in how someone continues to engage, even when getting nothing back. The demanding that appears in always being the one to reach out first. The demanding that manifests in rearranging plans to fit the avoidance schedule. These behaviors send one clear message. I want this more than you do, and I'll take whatever you give me. That message destroys any possibility of commitment. Commitment requires equal investment. It requires both people actively choosing to show up. When one person signals they'll show up no matter what, the other has zero motivation to choose anything different. Several specific patterns of subtle demanding make avoidance pull back further. Most people don't recognize they're doing these things because they think they're being patient and understanding, not realizing they're actually reinforcing the avoidance distance. The consistent initiator dynamic happens when someone always texts first, always makes plans, always checks in. This creates a situation where the avoidant never has to wonder or pursue because they know someone will always initiate contact. They never experience the absence that would make them reach out, and they never have to take the risk of initiating because someone else handles that consistently. Schedule accommodation follows a similar pattern. When someone always adjusts to match the avoidant's availability, drops other plans when the avoidant suddenly has time, or stays free whenever they decide to reach out, it teaches the avoidant that their time matters more and they control the dynamic. It removes any need for them to plan ahead or prioritize the connection because they learn their schedule always takes priority. Accepting low effort reinforces this further. When someone responds enthusiastically to minimal communication, acts satisfied with breadcrumbs, and never indicates that more is wanted or needed, it confirms that the avoidance bare minimum is enough. Why would they increase effort when decreased effort gets the same positive response? The feedback loop reinforces doing less, not more. The one-sided emotional investment creates perhaps the most damaging imbalance. When someone shares feelings, stays vulnerable, and offers support while the avoidant gives nothing back emotionally, it creates a relationship where one person does all the emotional labor and the other just receives. The avoidant learns they can get emotional support without providing it and receive vulnerability without offering any of their own. The relationship becomes one-directional, and this imbalance becomes normalized as just how things work between them. Each of these patterns reinforces the same fundamental dynamic. The avoidant can keep doing exactly what they're doing without any disruption to their comfort. And comfort is where commitment goes to die. People don't commit when they're comfortable with the status quo. They commit when the status quo no longer works for them. The disappearing protocol breaks this comfort. It's not about playing hard to get or making them jealous or punishing them for low effort. It's about genuinely redirecting energy away from someone who isn't reciprocating. It's about stopping the pattern of always being available, always understanding, always accepting less than what's actually wanted. This shift requires specific behavioral changes, not just an attitude adjustment. The actions need to be concrete and consistent. Vague intentions to be less available don't work. The avoidant needs to experience actual difference in the dynamic, not just slightly less enthusiasm in responses. The practical protocol involves several key shifts that build on each other. Skipping parts or implementing them halfway destroys the effectiveness. This isn't a casual suggestion to maybe pull back a little. It's a complete restructuring of how the dynamic works, starting with identifying when you're accepting less. This requires looking at actual behavior patterns over the past month, not what you hope is happening or what occasionally happens on good weeks. How often does communication happen? Who initiates it? How long between seeing each other? How much effort comes from each side? Write this down. The patterns become undeniable when they're on paper instead of just feelings. If 80% of texts come from one side, that's accepting less. If plans only happen when one person suggests them, that's accepting less. If emotional sharing only goes one direction, that's accepting less. If one person's schedule always accommodates the others, that's accepting less. The data doesn't lie. Feelings can rationalize and excuse, but written patterns can't. Once the pattern is clear, the immediate stop comes next. Not gradual reduction. Not slowly pulling back over weeks to see what happens. Complete stop of all initiating behavior. No more texting first. No more suggesting plans. No more checking in to see how they're doing. No more keeping conversation going when it dies out. This feels uncomfortable. It feels wrong. It triggers anxiety about losing the connection entirely. That discomfort is the signal that the pattern was one-sided. If stopping all initiation means the connection disappears, that reveals the connection was dependent on one person's effort. That's not a relationship. That's one person maintaining a connection while the other passively receives it. The immediate stop isn't temporary. It's not for a few days to see what happens. It's not until they reach out, and then everything goes back to normal. This is a permanent shift in how the dynamic works. Either the avoidant starts initiating and maintaining their side of the connection, or they don't. But the old pattern of one-sided effort doesn't return. Response matching becomes the new standard when the avoidant does reach out. The response matches their energy level exactly, not slightly less than theirs, not somewhat less enthusiastic. Exactly matched. They take 6 hours to reply. The response takes 6 hours minimum. They send 2 sentences. The response is 2 sentences. They suggest hanging out in 4 days. The response is about plans that might work in a week or so. They keep things casual and surface level. The response stays casual and surface level. No more compensating for their low effort with high effort. No more trying to create depth in conversation when they're giving surface-level engagement. No more injecting enthusiasm to make up for their lack of it. Their energy sets the ceiling for the interaction. This matching communicates something critical. Their effort level determines the relationship's level. Low effort gets low investment. Minimal communication gets minimal response. Vague plans get vague commitment. The direct correlation between what they give and what they get back shows them exactly where they've positioned the connection. Building a life that doesn't wait for them becomes essential during this shift. Making plans that don't include them or consider their possible availability. Developing interests that have nothing to do with them. Spending time with other people. Being genuinely busy when they suddenly have availability. This isn't performed busyness to make them jealous. This is actual investment in a full life that moves forward whether they're in it or not. The avoidant needs to see through actions, not words, that their minimal presence doesn't hold a central position anymore, that life isn't on hold waiting for them to decide to show up, that opportunities for connection have competition now from other priorities, other people, other interests. They don't get automatic first priority with last-minute availability. This often reveals the truth about the dynamic. If building a separate life feels like there's suddenly nothing left of the connection, that confirms the connection was already nothing. It was one person waiting around for another person to occasionally show up. Remove the waiting, and there's no relationship there. That's valuable information, even though it's painful. Maintaining this protocol regardless of their response is where most people fail. The avoidant notices the shift and suddenly starts reaching out more. They initiate plans. They increase communication. They show more interest and effort. And immediately, the old pattern returns. All the instant responses come back. All the availability comes back. All the accommodation comes back. This teaches the avoidant they just need to give minimal effort occasionally to reset everything back to the comfortable dynamic where someone else does the work. They learn that increased effort for a week or two gets them back to the status quo where they can be minimal again. The pattern doesn't actually change. It just cycles. The new dynamic needs to stay in place until their effort matches consistently over months, not days or weeks. When they start initiating plans, those plans still need to work with an existing schedule that doesn't revolve around their availability. When they increase communication, the responses stay measured and match their energy, rather than exceed it with enthusiasm for their improved effort. One good week doesn't erase months of minimal effort. Consistent behavior over time is what creates actual change. The avoidant needs to prove through sustained action that the shift in their effort is genuine, not just a temporary reaction to losing their comfortable position. The timing of this protocol matters critically. It doesn't work if it starts and stops based on the avoidant's responses. It doesn't work if it's used as a technique for 2 weeks and then abandoned when they don't immediately step up. It doesn't work if it's conditional on seeing quick results. The shift needs to be permanent. Either the avoidant steps up to meet the new standard over time, or they don't. But the old pattern of accepting less doesn't return either way. This permanence is what makes the protocol effective. The avoidant can't just wait it out. They can't give minimal increased effort and reset things. They have to actually decide if this connection matters enough to them to consistently show up for it. That decision can't be made in a week. It takes months of them maintaining higher effort before the dynamic stabilizes at a new level. Signs that the protocol is working show up in specific ways. The avoidant starts initiating contact more frequently without prompting. They start making concrete plans with actual days and times instead of vague suggestions about hanging out sometime. They start asking questions about life, interests, feelings, showing actual curiosity about the other person beyond surface-level check-ins. They start mentioning future plans that include both people, indicating they're thinking beyond just the immediate interaction. They start being more consistent in communication without needing prompts or having to be drawn out. They start showing up emotionally, not just physically, engaging with deeper topics and sharing their own thoughts and feelings more openly. These changes indicate their brain is processing the relationship differently. They're no longer in comfortable autopilot mode, where minimal effort maintains the status quo. They're actively choosing to engage because the guaranteed presence isn't guaranteed anymore. They're pursuing because they're no longer being pursued. They're investing because they're experiencing what it feels like when someone stops over-investing. But there are also signs the protocol isn't working. The avoidant continues the same minimal effort pattern even after weeks or months. They reach out only when they want something or when they're bored. They keep plans vague and cancel frequently without consideration for the other person's time. They disappear for days or weeks without communication and offer no acknowledgement when they return. They never initiate meaningful conversation, keeping everything surface level and casual. They don't ask questions or show curiosity about the other person's life. They stay emotionally unavailable, never sharing anything real or vulnerable. They treat the connection as something they access when convenient, rather than something they maintain consistently. When these signs appear and continue, the protocol stays the same. The energy stays redirected elsewhere. The acceptance of less doesn't return. Because the point isn't to use technique to force the avoidant to commit. The point is to stop investing in someone who isn't investing back. If they're not stepping up after experiencing the shift, they're showing through their actions that they're not willing or able to meet halfway. Several critical mistakes destroy the entire protocol and reset everything back to the ineffective dynamic. Breaking the pattern too early is the most common one. The avoidant reaches out after a week of distance, and suddenly, the old dynamic returns completely. All the immediate responses come back. All the availability comes back. All the effort and enthusiasm come back. This teaches the avoidant that they just need to give minimal effort occasionally to reset everything back to comfortable. They learn the shift wasn't real. They learn that this person will always revert to over-functioning in the relationship. Explaining the shift creates another major problem. Telling the avoidant about the new boundaries, explaining that the old pattern wasn't working and things need to change. Having conversations about needs and expectations and what the relationship should look like, all of this creates pressure and gives the avoidant something to react against. It makes the shift about them and their behavior rather than about someone genuinely redirecting their own life. The shift needs to happen through actions, not explanations. The avoidant needs to experience the difference, not hear about it. When someone explains what they're doing and why, it becomes a strategy the avoidant can recognize and resist. When someone simply changes their behavior without announcement or discussion, the avoidant has to sit with the actual experience of the shifted dynamic. Using the protocol as manipulation while secretly waiting for the avoidant to notice and change undermines everything. Going through the motions of building a separate life while actually just hoping they'll see it and step up. Matching energy while resenting it. Disappearing while checking constantly to see if they've reached out. Maintaining the appearance of being less available while actually remaining completely focused on them. The avoidant picks up on this inauthenticity. They sense when someone is performing distance versus genuinely redirecting their life. They can tell when someone is strategically less available versus actually busy with other priorities. The performance doesn't have the same effect as genuine redirection. It reads as manipulation, which triggers their defenses and makes them more distant rather than more engaged. The protocol works when it comes from a genuine place of self-respect. When someone realizes they've been accepting crumbs and decides that's no longer acceptable, regardless of whether the avoidant changes. When someone builds a full life because they genuinely want that life. Not because they're trying to make someone jealous or prove a point. When someone matches low effort because they're genuinely not willing to overinvest anymore, not as punishment or strategy, This genuine shift changes the entire energy of the situation. It's not about the avoidant anymore. It's about someone reclaiming their time, energy, and self-respect. The avoidant feels this difference. They sense when someone has actually moved on versus when someone is pretending to move on while still focused on them. The genuine version creates the actual shift in their perception. Avoidants respond to this shift because it changes their entire calculation. They're used to people pursuing them. They're used to people waiting around. They're used to putting in minimal effort and having someone stick around anyway. That predictability allows them to stay comfortable in their distance. When that dynamic disappears, when someone stops being a guaranteed presence, their brain has to process the relationship differently. Instead of seeing someone who wants too much from them, they start seeing someone who isn't waiting for them anymore. Instead of feeling pressure to be more, they start feeling curiosity about why the dynamic changed. Instead of having all the power in when and how connection happens, they lose that control. The loss of control is what creates the space for them to actually choose. This creates the only environment where genuine commitment can happen. The avoidant has to decide if they want this person in their life enough to put in actual effort. They have to evaluate whether this connection matters enough to show up for consistently. They have to consider commitment not as something being pushed on them, but as something they might lose access to if they don't actively maintain it. The protocol doesn't guarantee the avoidant will commit. Some won't. Some will continue their minimal effort pattern, and eventually the connection will fade completely as the other person's energy stays redirected elsewhere. And that outcome is just as valuable as them stepping up, because it reveals someone who wasn't willing to meet halfway. Someone who only wanted connection on their terms with minimal effort. Someone who wasn't actually available for mutual partnership. When the avoidant does step up, the protocol doesn't immediately end. Their increased effort needs to be consistent over months to prove the change is real and sustainable. They need to demonstrate through sustained action that they're actually choosing to invest in the connection, not just temporarily increasing effort to regain their comfortable position. One good week doesn't erase months of minimal effort. 2 weeks of improved communication doesn't override a pattern of inconsistency. A month of making plans doesn't undo a history of canceling or keeping things vague. Consistent behavior over extended time is what demonstrates actual change versus temporary adjustment. The relationship that forms from this protocol looks fundamentally different than the one that existed before. It has equal investment from both sides. Both people initiate contact and plans. Both people show up emotionally and make themselves vulnerable. Both people respect each other's time and effort. Both people maintain the connection actively, rather than one person carrying it, while the other passively receives. The old dynamic where one person overfunctioned to compensate for the other person's underfunctioning is gone. The new dynamic requires both people to function equally. If the avoidant can't or won't do that consistently over time, the connection naturally ends, not because of ultimatums or pressure, but because one person stopped accepting less than equal partnership. This is why the protocol works when it does work. Not because it tricks the avoidant into committing through psychological tactics, but because it creates the only conditions where real commitment can happen. When both people are actively choosing each other through their actions. When both people are investing equally. When both people are showing up consistently because they genuinely want to. Not because someone else is doing the work for both of them. Stop demanding. Start disappearing, not as a game or strategy to get a specific response, as a standard for what's acceptable in relationships, as a refusal to accept less than equal partnership, as a genuine redirection of energy toward building a full life that doesn't wait for someone else to decide to show up for it. The avoidant will either rise to meet that standard through consistent action over time, or they won't. Either outcome gives clear information. Either outcome is better than staying in a dynamic where one person accepts less while hoping for more. The protocol creates clarity, and clarity allows for actual decisions rather than indefinite waiting. If you've been in this dynamic with an avoidant, drop a comment about what patterns you recognize from your own experience. What's been the hardest part of pulling back your energy? Have you seen shifts when you stopped being so available, or did the connection just fade? If this helped you understand the avoidant dynamic better and gave you a clear protocol to apply, hit that like button. Subscribe for more relationship psychology that focuses on practical action instead of just understanding patterns. Thanks for watching.